Welcome back, everyone. So in our last video, we ended by discussing that there don't seem to be any characteristics that are uniform across entrepreneurs. So at this point, you might be thinking, so there's no entrepreneurship trait. Is there nothing that we can identify that is common across all successful entrepreneurs? No kind of special sauce that makes entrepreneurs unique? The answer to that question is actually yes, there is. It's not necessarily some innate uniform trait that individuals are born with, but successful entrepreneurs do seem to have common ways of thinking and patterns of behaving. As this Peter Drucker quote that you see on the screen would suggest, there's kind of this big myth that entrepreneurs are born and not made. But the truth is that they are made, and this is really good news for you. It means that we can teach you to think and behave more entrepreneurially. One thing that is common across the vast majority of entrepreneurs, in fact, by definition across entrepreneurial pursuits, trying to find something new, is that entrepreneurs often have to make their decisions in highly uncertain environments. They're making decisions in the absence of a lot of information. They don't necessarily know how things are going to turn out because they're trying something new that hasn't been tried before, at least as it relates to the specific market environment or customer base that they're operating in. So the question then becomes, how do entrepreneurs make good decisions in the absence of information or under conditions of extreme uncertainty? And a lot of the tools and techniques that we're going to be talking about in the rest of this module are going to revolve around this idea of how do entrepreneurs think in such a way that allows them to operate under these conditions of extreme uncertainty. So the first tool we're going to talk about is something called effectuation. Effectuation is a very different way of thinking about business problems that allows you to not get stuck in uncertain environments that you're making decisions in. And we're going to go into a lot more depth in our next lecture about the difference between what I'm going to talk about as causal reasoning on the one hand and effectual reasoning on the other hand. But right now, I just want you to think about how many of you thought you were going to have to write a business plan for this module. Probably a lot of you, because that's really one of the primary tools that we've used in the past for teaching entrepreneurship. What I want you to do is to forget about the idea of a business plan. There is a time and place for business plans. But at the nascent opportunity identification stage, they are the very best way to get stuck on a bad idea. And the thinking behind business plans represents a kind of thinking that we call causal reasoning. What I mean by that is thinking of a desired outcome. This is the business I want to start, and then coming up with a business plan to execute on that outcome. And for a long time, we actually thought about entrepreneurship in that way. And in an entrepreneurship course, you'd be taught this very causal-based business plan writing exercise. But the thinking now about the way that entrepreneurs successfully navigate these uncertain environments, and by the way, we're all, thanks to COVID, climate disruptions, global disruptions, other elements, operating in these hugely uncertain environments. So I think that this insight goes well beyond the scope of entrepreneurship. This is really though, what's at the heart of an entrepreneurial mindset is this idea of effectual reasoning. So we have causal reasoning on the one hand, effectual reasoning on the other hand. So what is effectual reasoning? This is starting not from the end point where you want to get to, but rather starting at where you are currently. So in the case of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs will often think about who they are, what they have, what they know, who they know, i.e. their social networks, and then come up with a range of possible outcomes, possible configurations, with all the means that they have at their disposal, their networks, their skills, their interests, etc. And at the end, arrive at an outcome in a much more, what we would call inductive way, rather than deductive. And this is really one of the key factors research has suggested that allows entrepreneurs to be successful in highly uncertain environments. Now, I know that this all sounds quite dense and theoretical, but we're going to unpack it a lot more in our next class. I'm just wanting to give you a snapshot of some of the topics we're going to be talking about over the next month. To put this a little bit more simply, though, Sarasvathy, who was one of the originators of this idea, uses the metaphor of cooking. So causal reasoning would be like starting with a recipe that you want to make, going shopping for the ingredients, and then making the dish. Effectual reasoning would start by looking around and saying, what ingredients do I have in my cupboard? What do I feel like cooking? Who am I cooking for? What do I cook well? Taste as I go along, adjust. And I think this quote that you see on your screen summarizes things well. So the question then becomes how to facilitate a process that lends itself to coming up with the right kinds of opportunities. Another aspect of this process is iteration. So one thing that has become very clear in entrepreneurship research that tries to identify those factors that make entrepreneurs successful is that they rely very heavily on the idea of iterating. So testing and learning to get new information about what's working and what's not working. This basic idea goes by a lot of different names with different associated tools. And we're going to talk about a lot of them. You've probably heard about things like the Lean Startup, Business Model Canvas, Minimum Viable Product, prototyping. Personally, I prefer the acronym ABLE, Ask, Build, Experiment, and Learn, because it first focuses on this idea of asking. And we're going to talk a lot about who you ask, how you ask, what kind of information you're asking for. But the basic insight is this idea of gathering initial information to form hunches, testing something in a very minimal and inexpensive way, and learning from that, and then incorporating what you've learned into future iterations. And the iterative nature of the early stages of entrepreneurship is why we advocate for the use of a business model canvas, where you can easily capture your idea and then test, modify your assumptions as they become clear to you, as a more nimble modeling tool than the business plan. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the business model canvas as well. Another set of tools we're going to talk about in this class is something called design thinking. So this is something you may have heard of before, but we're going to go a lot deeper into this tool because I think it's so powerful, not just for entrepreneurs, but the design thinking process is really something that's used quite widely in organizational environments more broadly. So basically, design thinking is a process for problem solving, a framework for problem solving that includes empathy and human-centeredness, and ideation and experimentation. The key to design thinking's effectiveness is that it starts with people and it gets those people, those users, involved in the design of their own solutions, and then thinks about the business model as kind of a secondary concern. This process goes through 5 different steps called empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So what do I mean by empathize? That sounds maybe kind of airy-fairy, not super concrete. But essentially, it's a very deep way to understand the problems and needs of individuals that you are designing a solution for, which, as I said earlier, is kind of the heart of entrepreneurship. And this isn't just for designers, because at heart, everybody who works in an organization is designing some solution for someone. So me as a professor, I'm trying to design solutions for my students and for the partners that I do research with, etc. I'm going to give you an example of Alberta School of Business alumni. His name is Samir Dar, and he founded a company called Sensasure. That company is basically an adult diaper company. And when he first started down that path, he had a really strong connection to the problem because he had a family member who had had issues related to adult incontinence. And so he had this idea that there was some problem and a group of people whose needs weren't being appropriately met. But he didn't know anything about adult incontinence needs. So he and the small team that he had assembled actually went and lived in a home for seniors for quite some time, actually. And so when I say empathize, this isn't some, kind of touchy-feely thing. This is a very successful business strategy that allowed Samir Dar and others like him to really understand and empathize with the needs of who they were trying to design the solution for. Once they were able to understand those needs, analyze the observations that they had made over that time, and then synthesize them in order to define the core problems that you have identified, you can then start to ideate. And this is then where a systematic ideation process can be helpful. Often people start with the ideation phase because it's more fun and exciting, but this is a fundamental error. So we're going to spend some time trying to understand, particularly at that very early stage, how do you empathize and define the problem appropriately that whoever you're trying to design a solution for might be experiencing. Then you ideate, then you go into prototyping through a minimum viable product and testing, and then incorporating those learnings. So we've talked about how entrepreneurs make decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty and an extreme lack of information, and some of the tools that can be helpful to them in this regard. The third thing that most entrepreneurs have in common is that they are trying to bring some new idea to market. We talked a little bit about more new versus less new earlier, but in general, entrepreneurs are trying to introduce something that the market has not seen in that specific form before. And of course, this can have a lot of benefits. We've all heard, for example, of the first mover advantage, but it can have downsides too. And these downsides are generally referred to as the liability of newness. So a big question for entrepreneurs is, how do you overcome the liability of newness? How do you convince people to get on board with this new idea when it may very well be something they've never heard of before? So we're also going to be talking about topics related to pitching, persuasion, networking, essentially convincing others of the validity of your idea, and also really rethinking how to build and deploy your network around your vision, whatever that vision might be. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about related to networking, persuasion, pitching, things like that, is going to go well beyond what would be specific to entrepreneurs. I think it's going to be very relevant to everybody in their daily lives. So that is a quick overview of entrepreneurship and to some of the topics at a very high level that we're going to be covering in the entrepreneurship module. See you next time.